Aloha and welcome to the Center for Chinese Studies at UH Manoa. My name is Baoyan Cheng. I'm a faculty member at the College of Education, Department of Educational Foundations. For this academic year, I'm the co-host of the CCS webinar series. And for this semester, I'm also the acting director of the Center for Chinese Studies. The CCS webinar series, which is open free for all, is one of the center's main platform for engaging scholars in Chinese studies worldwide. The goal is to foster interdisciplinary understanding of Chinese-speaking societies worldwide, as well as of Chinese civilization and its long connections to Hawaii. Today's webinar is a book launch for The Chinese Dream and Law, The Third Surge of Utopianism by Professor Shiping Hua, who will talk about his book for 35 to 40 minutes. And Professor Jeffrey Thomas and Professor Qiang Fang will each speak for 10 to 15 minutes as a discussant. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session, and we'll wrap up around 1:30. Before I turn over to Dr. Le Lin, the moderator, I would like to acknowledge the support of Associate Director Ni Zhang and Academic Support Specialist Angiana Chua. It is through their tireless efforts in hosting and promoting this webinar that we can all be here today. Today's moderator is Dr. Le Lin, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Hawaii and Manoa. His research centers on education, organizations, economic sociology, transnational sociology, and Chinese societies. His monograph, The Fruits of Opportunism, Non-Compliance, and the Evolution of China's Supplemental Education Industry, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2022. This book won the honorable mention of the Best Book Award on Asia Transnational by the American Sociological Association in 2023. Okay, the floor is now yours. Please, thank you for being the moderator.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bayan, for the introduction. So aloha, everyone. Thank you all for joining us and welcome to our CCS webinar series. Today, it is our great pleasure to hold this book launch event that features Professor Shiping Hua's new book, The Chinese Dream and Law, SUNY Press 2025. So this book situates the Chinese dream in the modern utopianism discourse since the late Qing, following Kang Youwei and Mao Zedong. As a tool to promote the Chinese dream, the legal reforms during the period depart from the thin constitutionalism of the first 3 decades of the post-Mao era and resembles aspects of legalism. So although the current regime has made some progress in protecting people's socioeconomic rights through law, it has retreated on upholding judicial independence to protect people's civil and political rights, especially those vis-a-vis the state. So obviously, this is a very important and timely book, and we look forward to hearing more from our author and panelists. So now it is my honor to welcome and introduce today's speaker and also the author of the book, Professor Shiping Hua. Professor Hua is Calvin and Helen Distinguished Chair in Asian Studies, Director of Asian Studies Program, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Louisville in the United States. He has published 4 solo-authored books and 12 edited volumes in English. He is the chief editor of a few book series, including Routledge Studies in Comparative Asian Politics and Asia in New Millennium with University Press of Kentucky. And also, I just learned that Professor Hua is also an alumnus of UH, so welcome back, and thank you for joining us, Professor Hua. We're also pleased to have 2 experts in this area as our discussants. Professor Jeffrey E. Thomas, he is Associate Dean for International Programs and Professor of Law, University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law. He is the Daniel L. Brenner Faculty Scholar, Professor of Law, and Associate Dean at UMKC School of Law. He earned his BA from Loyola Marymount University and his JD from the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on law and culture, the rule of law, the insurance law, with his co-author Yan Dong. He recently published the empirical study of the role of Chinese guiding case system in Chinese law in the Hong Kong Law Journal. We also have Dr. Qiang Fang. Professor Fang is a professor of East Asian history at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. He was president of Association of Chinese Professors of Social Sciences 2021 to 24, and Chinese historians in the United States from 2017 to 2019. He is the editor of American Review of China Studies, The China from Revolution to Reform. He has authored and co-authored many books, including, among others, Who is Studying China? A Guideline of Overseas China Centers, 2024, China Under Xi Jinping, A New Assessment, 2024, Sino-American Revelations, A New Cold War, The Communist Judicial System in China, 2022, and several other very interesting books. So welcome you, and thank you both for joining us. So now, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Hua to give a talk about his book. Let's give him a big round of welcome and applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Lin, for your very nice introduction. And also, I would like to thank the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Hawaii for organizing this webinar. The title of the book is The Chinese Dream and Law, the Third Search of Utopianism. That's the book title. Oh, it doesn't move. Can somebody help? Oh, okay, good. On this page, I'll skip this page because Professor Li has already read the summary of the book. Okay, first of all, the background. You know, this study Chinese politics in the last 12 years, from 2012 to 2024. That's 12 years, right? And a little bit of background. And this period was against the background of China's rise. And the regime put forward the slogan of the Chinese dream. First of all, I would like to say that the Chinese dream is not a daydream. Many people are very impressed by the rise of China, and lots of people are questioning whether China has reached the peak of its development. Well, historically speaking, probably China still have a room to grow. As of now, Chinese GDP is about 18% of the world total. 3,300 years ago, it was 23 of the world's GDP. So it is very possible that China will continue to rise and continue to grow. The international environment, of this period of time is the decline of freedom globally in the previous 15, 20 years, according to Freedom House, which is a Western institution that study the liberty globally every year. Every year they publish reports, and they found that for the last 15, 20 years, previously, the freedom had been in decline. And also, the academic journal, Asian Survey, published a special issue. And they were discussing the phenomenon that there is an emergence of strongmen in Asia, which means that a strong leadership, strong men, not strong institutions, have emerged in Asia, not only in one particular country such as China, but across the board in Asia. Many Asian countries have there has been emerge of strongmen. Domestic situation, the background against which that this study is based is the official corruption and growing income gap. And I don't have the time to go into details about this because there's plenty of data. I just quote one sentence from a TV program, right? TV program, and in the words of the one of the main leading characters in the program, it said that in the past, people did not believe that the government would do bad things. Nowadays, people do not believe the government would do good things. This is from the officially endorsed TV program In the Name of the People, and 人民的名义 is a very influential TV program, right? That's what to describe as the situation against which that this time period emerged. What is the Chinese dream? According to Xinhua News Agency, which is the official media outlet, the Chinese dream include at least the following. The Chinese dream is about human hope. The long-term hope for the Chinese is Datong. Datong means great harmony, right? Great harmony. And the modern hope is rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, largely referred to the 100-year humiliation. The Chinese nation suffered, Chinese people suffered a lot in the last century because of natural disasters, especially foreign incursions. The short-term hope is Kang. The Chinese government, we want to build the country. The first step is Kang. Kang means lesser prosperity. That is to double China's GDP from 2010 to 2020, right? What is striking here is that in the definition of Xinhua News Agency, modern ideologies such as socialism, democracy, capitalism, freedom are not included, right? Are not included. So apparently the Chinese dream is a vision based on the civilization, not really based on any particular modern time ideologies such as socialism, democracy, capitalism, and freedom. What is utopianism? Right? Utopianism is about human hope, right? It's about human hope. But utopianism means different things, right? It means different things for the Chinese and for the Westerners. For Western utopias, for instance, it refers to a no place. This place doesn't exist. But the content of the Western utopia and the Chinese Datong are similar. The Western utopia's content is that an egalitarian society ensured by some kind of authoritarian control. The Chinese Datong, is a better place. A better place means that it's a real human community that had existed prior to Confucius. So it's a better place. It's for real. It could happen, right? As far as the content is concerned, it's similar. It's an egalitarian society ensured by some kind of authoritarian control. What is an aberration? As Professor Lin read in the summary of the book, basically I made the assessment that the 30 years, the 3 decades immediately after the start of the reform in 1978 was an aberration. Aberration means that it deviated from the normal trajectory of China's modern political development. It's an unusual case. That 30 years is an unusual case. Why such is the case? First, I would like to say that all major Chinese leaders in the modern times endorse Datong, except those of the first 3 decades after the start of the reform. During the 30 years immediately after the reform, there was a theory of a primary stage socialism, but it was actually it reserved socialism, it postponed it into the indefinite future. Like Jiang Zemin said, that will be something 100 years or even later. They just postponed it into an indefinite future. And Datong, a great harmony, is a real human community of love all, not a afterlife paradise. Because in Christianity, there is something that are similar to Datong, right? That's paradise. Is a wonderful place. But for the Westerners, wonderful place does not exist in this world. It exists in the afterlife. After you die, you be a good Christian, and then you go to heaven. In heaven, there's a paradise, right? For this world, for lots of Christians, this current world is a vessel of sin. And I would say that Datong is the DNA of the Chinese. Forgive me for using this in a creative way. It's just in the heart of the Chinese. It was largely because that political leaders in modern times, regardless of their drastically different ideological viewpoints and political viewpoints, they all endorse Datong. Kang Youwei, for instance, the leader of the Late Qing reform, endorsed Datong, right? He wrote a book, Datong Ru, right? And Sun Yat-sen endorses Datong. He's the founder of the Republic, right? Chiang Kai-shek, who succeeded Sun Yat-sen, and also the head of the Kuomintang, also endorses Datong. Mao Zedong endorses Datong. Now Xi Jinping also endorses Datong. Actually, this is one of the central ideas of the Chinese dream. So the key thing is that regardless of ideological differences, all major Chinese leaders in modern times endorse Datong. I call it a third surge of utopianism. The first one is Kang Youwei, right? Late Qing reform. And Gong Quanxiao wrote an influential book about Kang Youwei, right? Described him as, utopia, right? Utopianism. And Mao Zedong, like Maurice Meisner, wrote books describing Mao as a utopian, right? Utopian. And what about other time periods? Other time periods, just the civil wars, World War I and World War II. And I would add also the 30 years immediately after the reform. The first 3 decades after the start of the reform, it was a situation, it was a very unique situation. It is a situation of the collapse of communist system in the US, in the former Soviet Union. For instance, Fukuyama called this the end of history, right? His book was controversial, but very influential, right? Primary stage of socialism postponed socialism into the indefinite future, right? Okay, let me move on. The universal value of Chinese and Asian culture, right? Does Asian culture, such as Datong, have any universal values? I would say, unlike the Japanese culture and Judaism, Chinese hope has a universal value application, right? A universal claim, right? Universal claim, because the Japanese, they believe that the Japanese race is uniquely superior, right? It cannot be copied across the other ethnicities. Judaism also believe that the Jews are chosen people by God and so on and so forth. Chinese hope has a universal claim, means that in the a good Chinese Confucian gentleman hope to turn everybody into a gentleman, right? Confucian gentleman. In the words, some of the Chinese government never said that the Chinese dream is the world's dream, but the Beijing's ambassador to UK, he said this. The Chinese dream is the world dream. I'm not saying that his claim represents that of the Chinese government, but he is influential, right? And he is not alone. He is not alone. Like a Malaysian Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, said that Asian values are world values. European values are just European values. In other words, the Asian way is the world's way, right? It has universal values. And some influential Western philosophers also feel this way. One is the British historian, Arnold Toynbee. Basically, he said that Chinese culture is good for the world, right? Maybe it's useful to unify the world, right? Another is a German philosopher, Leibniz, praised the Chinese culture and saying that Europeans can learn a lot from the Chinese culture, right? So it's not that the Chinese, Asians feel that way. Some influential Western philosophers also feel that way. And why Datong could be utopian? In ancient times, Datong is a better place, right? Datong is a better place. And it is for real, right? It is for real. Because Confucius imagined, or Confucius believed that prior to him, that China was pretty good, right? China was pretty good. There was a Datong period in ancient China, right? And I will say at that time that people do believe that what Confucius said, right? And I will say that that was largely because of geographical location and relatively uniform ethnicity is the Han, right? So it could be a better place, right? Better place. In other words, we can make it happen in this world, right? Now it could become a no place, just like the Western utopias, right? Because currently we are living in a diverse world with more civilizations claiming superiority, such as Christianity, Christian culture, and Islam, for instance. Are they going to endorse Datong, so on and so forth? I doubt it, right? I doubt it. Datong also, I'm sorry, Datong also coincide with modern utopias. The Chinese Datong actually is similar to modern utopias. It's an egalitarian society ensured by some kind of authoritarian control, right? So, we call it utopianism, right? Because it's very similar to the Western utopias in the sense that it imagined an egalitarian society ensured by some kind of authoritarian control, right? Next. In the summary, right? In the summary, I quoted another scholar's description of the 30 years immediately after the reform started, a thin constitutionalism. Lin White is the scholar who called this period of time a thin constitutionalism. What is thin constitutionalism? It was some kind of quasi rule of law. Rule of law is a Western concept, right? In the words of Lin White, that period of time, is that a real constitutionalism? It is not, but it looks like there are some similarities, and also China was moving in that direction, right? It's a de-emphasis of the role of ideology, separating the party function from the government one, and striving for some kind of judicial independence. Okay, next page. Why is law needed for the Chinese dream? At the beginning of the reform, law was badly needed because it was a rational response to the lawless Cultural Revolution. Lots of government officials during the Cultural Revolutions, they were purged, right? They remember bitterly what will happen to them if there's no law to protect them. So there was a universal endorsement of law, some kind of law, immediately after the Cultural Revolution. That is the start of the reform, right? Currently, law is also very badly needed by the current regime, because I describe the current economic system as a state capitalism, which means that largely it's capitalism, but the state play a very important role in the country's economy. I call them state capitalism. State capitalism needs law to regulate the market, right? You cannot regulate the market without law, right? And another thing is the foreign trade needs law, right? At the peak, about 20 years ago or so, about 70% of China's GDP was generated through foreign trade. In recent years, it goes down, Currently, slightly under 40% of the China's GDP is generated by foreign trade. That's still a lot. And you need to have law. Otherwise, no foreigners would want to trade with China or invest in China. So the usefulness of law is very obvious here. People's socioeconomic rights need to be protected by law. In recent years, one of the achievements that I said in the book is the publicity of the civil code, Chinese civil code. Chinese civil code, in my view, is a major achievement in an attempt to protect people's socio-economic rights, right, through law, right, through law. Also, anti-corruption need a law, right? Anti-corruption need a law. Okay. What is legalism? Because please, the Professor Lin read the summary of the book, and this was printed at the back of the book, and legalism here is the capital letter L. Legalism was by Shangyang, right? By Shangyang, some years ago, right? By Shangyang some years ago. And in Qing Dynasty, for instance, right? Qing Dynasty, for instance. For me, legalism has at least 4 characteristics. First is they believe in pragmatism. Law does not have a moral purpose. It serves a pragmatic purpose. So this is very different from the Western sense. In the Western sense, the rule of law has a moral character because everybody is created by God or by nature. So morally, law protects each person's right. It has a moral characteristic in the rule of law in the Western sense, right? But in the Chinese sense, it is pragmatism. It doesn't have anything to do with, it doesn't serve a moral purpose. Second characteristic is instrumentalism. Instrumentalism believe that is a tool. Law is a tool. And when you need it, you pick it up. When you don't need it, you drop it off, right? It is of secondary importance. What is more important in the governance? Morality, Confucianism is more important than law. And law is just an instrument. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not useful, right? That's instrumentalism. The third characteristic is a statism, right? Statism. In the Chinese history, private laws are weak in pre-modern times. Statism was the characteristic, and private laws are weak. The fourth one is equality before law is questioned, right? Is questioned. Sometimes it's given up. For instance, during the Qing Dynasty, filial piety could be more important than the law. For instance, if somebody cover up a crime committed by his father, sometimes he is forgiven. Although the father committed some kind of crime, but you are the son, and filial piety is more important than the law, right? Than the law. And then before the establishment of the People's Republic of China in the red base means the communist forces, guerrilla bases, and so on and so forth. There was a government there, and there was a constitution. And in at least one document, I saw that class is more important than the law, which means that the good class is the poor peasant, and the bad class is the landlord. If a poor peasant and a landlord committed pretty much the same crime, and then the landlord will be punished more severely than the poor peasant. In other words, class is more important than law. Next page. Governance, democracy, and universal applicability. This is some kind of theoretical considerations. How do we evaluate, this last 12 years, right? How do we, there are some theoretical considerations to be considered, right? Fukuyama wrote an influential book, right, calling the democracy, Western democracy, a perfect system. It cannot be improved anymore, right? And America is a good example. America is a good example. But in recent years, he seemed to modify his theory quite a bit by saying that, a democracy can have poor governance. He basically said that, in terms of governance, it's not good, right? It's not good. America has lots of problems, although it's a democracy, a good one, right? A good one. So theoretically speaking here, a good democracy can have poor governance. Can we have effective governance without democracy? I think lots of people will say that as far as the governance is concerned, China has been doing not bad, right? Made some achievements, high-speed railways, for instance, lots of infrastructures and so on and so forth, electronic cars and so on and so forth, right? But is it a democracy as we understand in the West? It's not, right? It's not. Now China said, well, we have our own definition of democracy. Our definition is a whole process democracy. Well, that's not what people in the West understand it, right? So the question, another theoretical question is that, can we have effective governance without democracy? Another question that comes into my mind is that, is there any particular model applicable to other parts of the world? In other words, America has a development model. Is this applicable to all countries in the world, right? And immediately after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and people don't seem to doubt about it, right? The propensity of the Chinese government in the first 3 decades after the reform is to copy from Western countries, especially copy from the United States, right? Now is in question, right? Now is in question. A question to further go along the line is that, is any particular model applicable to other parts of the world? Because in recent years, some Chinese scholars argue that the Western model is not applicable to the world. The Chinese model is more applicable to the world. So theoretically speaking, this is a question, right? This is a question possibly without a clear answer or without a consensus on this. Last page. The case of China. Basically, this page is the general evaluation of this 12 years, right? I would say that people's social economic rights are more protected by law, right? And the good example is the civil code. The civil code, it took China several decades to write this civil code. And finally, under Xi Jinping, it was finished, right? It was finished. Lots of people's socioeconomic rights are written into law. For instance, divorce, how to handle properties after divorce, how to handle properties after somebody died, inheritance, and so on and so forth, how to protect people's privacy, and so on and so forth. What about land use? After 60 years or 70 years, how can you make sure that your interest, your benefit can be kept, and not to be taken away by the state, and so on and so forth. So all these things are written into the civil code largely. However, judicial independence, in my viewpoint, has shrunk. In a sense, lots of times these things, is sort of processed with a politicized legal system. Growing corruption is slowed, according to data from World Bank and International Transparency, right, through a politicized legal system as well, which means it's not by an independent judicial system. It was politicized, right? Income gap between the rich and poor is narrowed, according to data from the World Bank. Before the current regime came to power in 2012, the income gap between the rich and poor in China is larger than that of the United States. After 10 years of efforts, it was reversed. And the income gap between the rich and poor in the United States is slightly larger than China. So it's kind of reversed, not by a whole lot, but by some degrees, right? However, there are some negatives, right? China's growth rate was cut in half. It used to be double-digit growth, right? And now it's about 5% or even less than that. Is this model applicable to other countries? Some Chinese scholars argue yes, right? Yes. I would say, well, this is questionable, right? This is questionable. We'll have to see. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Hua, for walking us through your new book. It's really intriguing to see how you connect, study of political thought like Dream with, legal studies, right? Let's now welcome our two discussants, and let's start with Professor Jeffrey Thomas. Could you please give a comment on Professor Hua's book? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate the University of Hawaii for inviting me to be part of the program. And I'm happy to review and talk about this book. I want to start by saying that I think it's an excellent piece of work, that it provides a really sweeping scope that starts in sort of prehistoric period and runs all the way up to the present. And as indicated, incorporates this cultural analysis with a legal analysis. And so it's really a great piece of work. I recommend it. It's a very good read. And I want to make basically or talk about two aspects of the book that struck me. And I come at this from the standpoint of a legal academic, and so law is very important to me, although I'm also interested in the interaction between law and culture. The first point I want to make is that I agree with the book's premise that this third utopian effort is akin to a form of legalism, and defining that as rule by law. That's been quite explicitly embraced by the reforms under the current administration. And I think that's really accurate. But I have some concerns about that I'm going to address in just a moment. But that's a point that I totally agree with. The second point I want to make is that I'm less sure about the other major premise of the book, that this idea of datong is a cultural phenomenon that's driving these reforms. And I'm sure a lot of this is my experience and perspective from the West and from an American perspective, where the question to me is that really driving reforms, or is this an authoritarian figure who's using rhetoric, history, and essentially propaganda to justify centralizing and grabbing more power? And so I don't have a view about that one way or the other. I'm simply unsure about it, and I'll talk a little bit about that in some more detail as well. With respect to the legalism point and the idea of rule by law, I definitely agree that there is an increasing instrumental use of law in the current reforms, and that is consistent with the trend over the last 30 to even 50 years in China, that we see that kind of development of law. And And I think it's been very helpful, maybe essential, but certainly helpful for economic development. I agree that the achievement of the civil law is significant, and that is very much a foundation for economic development and continued economic development and growth. And I agree that there's some distinction between civil rights that are social and those that are political, though when I think of civil law and the things that are addressed by the civil law, even though we don't use that construction in the US, we think of civil law in the same way, and we think of political rights as a separate category of rights. So I'm not concerned about the fact that the civil law does not include political rights. I also think that the anti-corruption effort is certainly important and notable. And I agree that the reliance on the Communist Party rather than the legal system is a problem in terms of it being legalism. So I guess I would characterize it as somewhat quasi-legal, that it has some trappings of legalism, but it clearly isn't part of the legal system. And it doesn't have the kind of legal protections or the kind of transparency that we normally think of within the legal system. So that's a whole nother issue, and I want to address the anti-corruption efforts a little more in more detail in just a moment. The biggest point I want to make in connection with legalism is the point about judicial independence, and I do agree that judicial independence has been eroded and that it has been diminished. And that's clearly the case with respect to anti-corruption, where the whole anti-corruption enterprise has been taken out of the judicial system and moved into an administrative kind of party review system. So that's a serious problem. I also think that there's a serious problem with the shift and movement towards the ideological emphasis within law and with this kind of accountability within the legal system for ideology. And as a consequence of that, I feel like judges are easily threatened by not having the right kind of ideological orientation. The problem with these kind of ideological initiatives is that it's so difficult to tell whether you are consistent with or not consistent with the ideology. And so you're very much subject to attack for having the wrong ideology. And I think that that is a serious threat on judicial independence. So what does this mean, though, in terms of legalism and the rule by law? I think that there is an inherent tension between the effort to use the legal system to rule by law and the effort to restrict the power of the judiciary. If we look at this historically, and I'm not a historian, I don't have as much background and knowledge as others on this point, but one of the shifts we see is away from the civil service examination for high-level authorities to people who are appointed by the party and party members with civil servants underneath them. And so I think that is indicative of a lack of, or consistent with a lack of independence. So my concern is this: by having less judicial independence, the ability of the judiciary to enforce the legal norms that are required for rule by law and required or helpful to economic development are more uncertain. That we just can't be sure that the legal system is going to actually enforce these things in a way that's neutral and fair and predictable, because there is this ideological threat, there is party supervision, there are things that restrict judicial independence. So those two things are both true, legalism and the erosion of judicial independence, but they're in conflict with each other. And so in the long run, I don't know what that means. There has certainly been a very long-term perspective by foreign investors and by some within China that they would rather not rely on the courts to enforce their promises, that they agree to arbitration, they have international arbitration because they have a higher level of confidence in fairness, neutrality, predictability of this kind of arbitration instead of the judicial system. And so the question that I'm raising is that maybe in the long run, the desire of having rule by law be efficient and effective might in the long run promote a little greater judicial independence, which then might move us a little more towards rule of law. The other thing I want to talk about briefly in terms of legalism and rule by law is this anti-corruption effort. And I certainly agree that this is not legalism, maybe quasi-legalism, and that the serious weakness here is that while there's accountability, that accountability is not transparent. And as a consequence, this kind of anti-corruption effort, which is true of many authoritarian systems, it can be used as a weapon against the opposition. And so those who are politically inconsistent with those in power can then be subject to charges of corruption. And if there's no transparency, there's no way to stop that. So I think that because of that concern, because of that lack of accountability, that the effort of anti-corruption, it's been effective and it's been good, but in the long run may not be enough because the people will still be suspicious that either there are political motivations or that corruption has been reduced but not sufficiently eliminated, that there may be an effort, there may be a requirement or a desire for greater transparency. And so it may be that this desire for legalism will help to improve the anti-corruption effort or perhaps help to improve judicial independence, which then could help move towards a rule of law. I do agree that the desire for legalism is a reaction to the Cultural Revolution, but I think that there's that same kind of tenet existing now within China. It's not as strong because we don't have a current cultural revolution, but the corruption is something that causes dissonance for the average citizen. And so in order to get past that dissonance, having greater transparency may be the solution. So in the last couple of minutes here, I want to turn to this question of whether the Chinese dream is culture or whether it's propaganda. And I totally agree that the Datong narrative is very convincing and persuasive with its connection to Confucianism, and that it certainly has long-term use. But the fact that it has long-term use does not necessarily mean that it's real and not instrumental, right? There's a long history of authoritarianism in China as well, and it could be that it is a convenient ploy or a narrative device, a propaganda device that can be used as well for authoritarianism over time, not just now. So, I have concerns about the long-term nature and the genuineness, the fact that we have the articulation of Datong, but we no longer have civil service exams, at least not civil service exams with the same significance. That is, again, intention. The fact that ideology has become a very important part of the legal system, and that ideology is not Confucianism, it's ideology that's grounded in a version of Marxism that is what the Chinese Communist Party espouses, right? And so there's tension there between the two. And, power is being centralized. And I admit that there's sort of an American bias in my perspective here, but as an American, I'm extremely nervous and suspicious of centralized power. And so the idea that you will have centralized power that will be better for people, I'm just not sure I'm going to agree to that. I think that there's been great accomplishment, and there's been, for example, progress on the income gap, but that could be motivated by this desire for stability, which is an effort to maintain power and to have the centralization of power. So I'm not sure about that. I think there's been great progress in the economy, and that it is a remarkable narrative about state capitalism. But again, this is an American bias. I'm not sure how much of that is capitalism and how much of that is the state. The state has interfered with capitalism, maybe at the right level, maybe too much, maybe not enough. but certainly bringing in private property and capitalism and incentives has been very effective. I think the whole area of foreign affairs is very interesting, very different. I don't have time to really talk about that, but I'll end with one final point, and that is one of the biggest takeaways for me is the historical narrative about stability and instability, and the stories about the persistent peasant uprisings, which helps me better understand the government's concern about stability and their investment in efforts to maintain stability. And that particular narrative, I think, is very interesting, very important, and is maybe a basis for more transparency, better judicial independence in order to maintain the stability that is sought. It's possible that you could have stability with a beneficent authoritarian, but it's also possible that the authoritarian is eventually going to run out of goodwill, and that the growing middle class is going to challenge that and want to have greater transparency and greater predictability. So it will be interesting to see what happens. I really like the book. I think it's a great piece of work, a great addition to the literature, and I'm interested to see where matters go from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. Thanks for sharing your insights and for some questions. If time allows, I would like also to invite Dr. Hua to respond some of your questions. But let's now turn to Dr. Qiangfang for comments. But also before that, can I also, I saw some questions being posted in the Q&A sessions. I would further encourage our audience to please share your questions, and we'll take them after Dr. Qiangfang's comments. So, Professor Qiang, please.
Okay, thank you very much for Dr. Lelin's introduction, and also, more important, I want to thank University of Hawaii and also Professor Hua invite me to make the comments and today to attend this today's webinar. I think it's very useful, and especially I just heard Professor Thomas' comments and very useful and very informative. So I also like Professor Thomas. I think this book very important. Professor Hua's book very important. I read it with much joy because many of the things and his arguments I really like because it's some of the questions and theoretical questions I have also thought for many years since 2012. I think the most important value of this book is its detailed and well-referenced and nuanced study and arguments on the linear and revival of the ancient Confucian Da-Tong tradition in the 20th century. In particular, Professor Hua puts Xi's China Dream Utopia in the larger context of the Confucian Da-Tong and tradition, which are apparently rooted in the ancient Confucian tradition. Its earliest mention of the Da-Tong comes from Li Ji, but Li Ji, it's still doubtful that Li Ji is directly related to Confucius, and because it's this book came out in the Han Dynasty, at least 300 years or 400 years after Confucius' death. So this Da-Tong in the post-Opium War era, when China suffered a streak of losing wars to European and Asian powers and became a semi-colonial state, scholars and politicians like Kang Youwei and Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, who had cherished and championed utopian future for China. From Kang Youwei's Da-Tong Shu to Sun Yat-sen's Pinjin Di Quan, like this to Mao's edification of people's commune, based on his understanding of Marxism and communism. Professor Hua argues that the latest utopia of Da-Tong is Xi Jinping's China Dream, which was probably cultivated in his 2020 argument about 共同富裕, like common and prosperity. which aims to attain an ideal society in conjunction with Confucian Datong ideal and plus communism. So Professor Hua he's takes several approaches to about Xi Jinping's common prosperity and also Datong or China Dream. This but Xi's way as Hua argues, Professor Hua argues that Xi's way to attain attain his dream of China Dream through the legalism, right? As a mixture of legalist tradition, pre-reform practice, and Western legal system. But Xi's legalism is rule by law and not rule of law. I think that's and then he used several key laws that's passed during Xi Jinping's like rule in the past 12 and 13 years on a constitution, for example, right? He said Professor Hua especially compared the 2018 constitution with the 1982 constitution and at the beginning of the Deng Xiaoping's rule and also he talks about national security law and anti-corruption law as also Dr. Thomas just especially focused on that, and the civil rights law. And I like Dr. Thomas' opinion that the civil rights law also should include political rights law, right? And also in foreign relations law. These are the several key laws during the Xi's like 12-year and 13 years rule that he focused on, that he applied legalism into realizing those his dream of not his dream, that's a China dream, or also Datong. So this I think this book can also the argument of the book and theoretical theoretical arguments, and also the format of the book and the organization of the book are very very good and very cogent. So that's but I still think there are something theoretical and issues or arguments that, and also historical issues that I have as a legal historian. I still want to ask Professor Hua, and probably hope he can elaborate a little bit more. For example, that says the first one is Xi Jinping's like Professor Hua used the pinyin, right? Like 依法治国, and I just wondering this 依法治国 or 依法治国, right? Because in the late 1990s or early in 2000s, there was a debate on China Youth Daily. That's a number of Chinese legal scholars. They just raised the issue, right? The rule by law or rule of law, or use 依法治国 or 依法治国, right? What's the difference between 依法治国and 依法治国? So I think that some of the leaders, for example, like Jiang Zemin in 1995, or 1997, I'm sorry, in the 15th Party Congress, and for the first time, he said, that's English is used the rule of law, but in his Chinese text, he used the 依法治国. But in other, in 1999, that's the Constitution revised, and for the first time to put the rule of law in the Constitution. That's the one. So everybody talk about the rule of law. Well, but in Chinese, there's a huge difference. 我依法治国, 我依法治国, or the this 治法治, this 治 is a 制度的制, or like an instrument or a system or mechanism, or another one is govern, like water, right? With 三点水 that's 治. So there's a fundamental difference, as Professor Hua and also Dr. Thomas also talk about this, right? Rule by law and rule of law. According in my own research, like about 20 years ago, I went through the Chinese history and to study the rule of law. You see, this rule of law, and actually there are three three legal forms in Chinese history: rule of law and rule by law, and also rule without law. Rule without law happened only in the Wu Zetian's reign, and also in the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 1976. There are three forms, and so the rule of law actually, unlike many Chinese scholars argued that there was no rule of law in Chinese history, but actually, if we just believe that rule of law, the core of the rule of law is nobody is above the law, then we can find some periods, mostly in the Han Wendi and Tang Taizong, for example, in the Tang Dynasty, and many other periods. The rule of law actually happened in Chinese history. I want to make just quote Tang Taizong's words. Tang Taizong once said, "Law comes from heaven." This is similar to what Aristotle talk about law, and comes from reason, comes from God and human reason. So given the law some divine meanings. So if law comes from heaven, as a son of heaven, like Chinese emperor says, son of heaven, they must abide by the law. And Tang Taizong did that very well. In many cases, I don't have time to talk here. He actually followed the law. So there's a rule of law in Chinese history really happened, but not in most periods. In most periods, the law was as both right, scholars talk about this and as instrumentalism about the law, and law was used as a tool to govern. So one. So another one is issue is like the legalism. So what about legalism? Everybody talks about legalism comes from Shangyang, whatever, but legalism is Xishan legalism really the Shangyang or Hanfei's legalism. Yeah, based on Shangyang Hanfei's legalist writings, we can see they are very close to the rule of law, because Shangyang explicitly mentioned, right, that's everybody and below the ruler, right, should follow the law. If anyone violates the law, including those and the prince and the highest ranking officials, if they violate the law, they would be punished as commoners. So if that is for the legalism, then it's close to rule of law, but ruler is still above the law. And also in Chinese history, everybody talks about Confucianism dominated Chinese history since Han Wudi, right? And Dong Zhongshu's and like Bai Chou Bai Jia, that's the dominant make Confucianism a dominant like a culture and ideology and political and ethics in China. But also many legal scholars, they especially legal historians, they also understand that law as inside the Chinese history and culture. And outside that looks like Confucianism, but actually in the vein of Chinese history, and also every Chinese ruler, they put the law at make the law as the top of their priority. The best example is Zhu Yuanzhang, the founding father of the Ming Dynasty. Even before he founded his dynasty in 1368, he had already drafted the Da Minglü, the Great Code of the Ming, right, and made sure that everybody the law should be dominant and in that dynasty, and every official and commoners should follow that law, right? So this is the one, and some other issues and minor issues I think is this like this Professor Hua's book did not mention criminal law, right? Criminal law also accounts for a very important part of the Chinese law. For example, like 2020, the Chinese law made a crime like of to provoke trouble as in a major crime. That crime actually comes from the earliest period, right? Like 1950 and even in the 1930s, in the base period, early communist leaders like Mao and already passed like punishing and counter-revolutionaries like 惩治反革命条例 already. This is like a new form I call for 惩治反革命条例, and maximum and punishment is 5 years. So this is the criminal law, and but I don't see that appeared in the book, and I don't know what's the relationship between legalism and also Xi Jinping's China dream and criminal law. How do they accommodate to each other? And the last issue is I just forgotten. That's the Xi Jinping's rule of law. I want to talk a little bit about that. Xi Jinping also has the rule of law. I published an article last year talk about the rule of law under Xi Jinping. If we put a question mark on the law, and then we will find also the Chinese leaders, including Xi Jinping, also adopted the rule of law, because this law is not this law is the party's law, right? Or the ruler's law, and it's not about something about the Western idea of the rule of law, and with the law is above everything. But if this is used law, it's kind of more like an instrumentalism, right? Of the legal instrumentalism, use the law. But if we use this law, not a rule by law, we can also argue that Xi's rule of law is not coming from the West, right? It's Communist Party's own, and also Xi Jinping's own law. So this is yes. There are some other minor issues about historical issues, like Professor Hua mentioned, argues that Wenge, that's a cultural revolution, does not have law, and actually, that's in my recent study published book, that says a cultural revolution also has law, and some of the judges, especially after 1972, right, could make decisions, make rulings on the cases in accordance with the law, as because after Lin Biao death in late 1971. So there's a restoration of the judicial system. So, but many people, and probably most people, believe, well, there's no law in the Cultural Revolution. But my study with some of the legal cases and from the archives show that Cultural Revolution also has the law. Yeah, there are some minor issues I will let because of time. I don't have much time left, and so I would probably talk to Professor Huan privately and let him know. All right, and thank you so much for the invitation again. Give me the time to make a comment.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Fan, for your sharing your perspectives with historical insights. So we have about 4 questions in the Q&A. Yeah, so maybe let's just, since there's some overlap between those questions raised by the audience and our 2 discussants, maybe we can just go over the questions from the audience, and if you see fit, you can just address some of them together. So I'll start with the questions in the temporal order. So the first question is, thank you, Professor Hua, for your interesting talk. I want to ask a question. Do you think that legalism, the state ideology of the Qing Empire, is still an inseparable component of the Chinese way of life? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. First of all, I want to thank the 2 discussants, and their questions are very, very insightful. I learned a lot. As far as this question from the audience is concerned, is this legalism that was developed more than 2,000 years ago, is it going to be part of the Chinese people's life? I don't know. All I can see is that in the last decade or so, the elements of legalism has increased The elements of legalism have increased. But in the first 3 decades, China's legal reform was largely moving in the direction of the West. And I agree with what Youwei said, that it was some kind of, quasi rule of law, right? But now it's not much of a criticism, because according to some Chinese scholars at well-known universities in China, and some even make the argument by saying that Shangyang's legal system was the best. And in the following more than 2,000 years, the Chinese have never been able to catch up with Shangyang. And I don't think I'm going to agree with this, but this is how strongly even some top scholars that they feel about legalism that was developed more than 2,000 years ago. So I guess, elements of legalism will be part of the Chinese system and in the near future.
Okay, thank you for providing your thoughts. So next question, Dr. Hua, you mentioned the third surge of utopianism in the recent years. Now, what are the main differences between today's utopianism and the previous 2 versions of utopianism by Kang Youwei and Mao Zedong? Yeah, thank you.
Basically, there are some shared characteristics. And one is the move towards an egalitarian society. And in the first 2 surges by Mao Zedong and by Kang Youwei, they all envision a society that is equality across the board, right? Ensured by some kind of authoritarian control, right? The third one is also, as I said, that according to data from World Bank, under the current regime in the last decade or so, that China's income gap has slightly narrowed. It used to be that the income gap, slightly narrowed, right? I wish, and they can do more to narrow the gap between the rich and poor. But they worry about scare entrepreneurs away. If you squeeze them too hard, they are going to run away to other countries, especially to the United States. If they do not fear this, I think the push towards an egalitarian society will be even more powerful. So if you say that what's the commonality, right? I think the push towards some kind of egalitarian society is something that they share. And also, the method is authoritarian control. It's not really through a sort of rule of law in the West, for instance. It's through some kind of egalitarian control. That's what the 3 surges of utopianism share in common. One is the strive for equality. Second is some kind of authoritarian control.
Okay, thank you. So the third question, also from an anonymous attendee, the question is, as the many in the younger generation increasingly turn their backs on Confucianism, or at least take it less seriously, how does this process pose challenges to the modern ideas of Datong and the Chinese dream?
And I agree that as far as the values are concerned, the Chinese young people are not really traditional, right? And actually, I visited China before the pandemic. I visited China almost every year because I took American students to China, for a 1-month study in China for 15 years. After the pandemic, it was stopped, right? But after the pandemic, I went back to China last year as well, interact with Chinese students. I think as far as values are concerned, do they care about Confucian values? Or are they mostly liberalism oriented? I think they are Chinese young people and the young people in some other societies, including the United States, they share lots of similarities with each other in terms of values. So this promotion of Confucian values is largely from the top, right? From the top. And the reason why the top want to promote remote society along the line of Confucianism is they follow the global trend. The vision of going back as far as the values is concerned has happened not only in China. So China, the leadership want to go back in terms of values. Confucian Datong, legalism, that's going back. But other people are doing the same thing, like Putin. Putin was the leader of Russia for 20 years. Under him, Orthodox Church has gained more influence, right? Modi in India. India is the largest democracy, but he did something that in violation of human rights, that the United States at one point refused to give him a visa to visit the United States. So this going back to history for solution of current problems are adopted by the ruling elites across the board, right? But what about the young people's feelings? Young people's feelings, I think, they're similar. But the Chinese young people are just as nationalistic as the young people in South Korea in the 1980s. If you are talking about democracy and liberal values, I don't think they have too much problems with that. But if you are talking about liberalism, if you are talking about the nationalism, South Korean young people were not very nationalistic in the 1980s, and the Chinese young people are also very nationalistic. They share this in common. But as far as lifestyle things are concerned, I don't think there's too much of a difference in those societies. So the attempt to going back for solution of the current society is mostly coming from the elites, ruling elites. It's not only true for China, but also true for Russia and India.
Okay, and our last question from our audience is from our colleague, Kate Zhou from Political Science Department, and she would like to ask Professor Hua if there is a linkage between Chinese political culture of Gui and Datong dream.
Chinese political culture of what? Gui. What is Gui?
I think that's the Chinese character Gui, like kneeling down, kneeling.
Koto, yeah.
Koto, yeah. Is that what you mean, Kate?
Well, certainly you can say that. And let me give you one example. In the last 1,000 years, the Chinese nation, the Chinese people, the Han people, was under the rule of ethnic minorities for 400 years. And the Mongols for about 100 years. And the Manchus for almost 300 years. Another country that is similar to the Chinese is India. In the last 1,000 years, for about 800 years or so, India was ruled by aliens, right? Nowadays, in the case of China, we can say, well, the Mongols is actually one of us, Manchus is one of us, because China has 56 ethnic. But at that time, the Mongols were viewed as aliens, and Manchus were viewed as aliens, but still the Chinese accepted them. I will say it's a cultural thing because the Chinese people, by and large, is moderate in terms of temperament, right? In terms of temperament. And it's not because of human nature, it was largely because the Chinese society has been a farming society for several thousand years under the emperors, under the monarchies, and so on and so forth. So you can say, well, Chinese people tend to agree right? Not really a cultural thing. I think that's just part of Chinese culture, right? Part of Chinese culture. They just reinterpret it. They view, well, there's nothing wrong, to be ruled under Mongols. There's nothing wrong to be ruled under Manchus, because this 56 nationality take turns to be the ruler and so on. But at that time, it was not viewed that way, and the Chinese people accepted it. I think on this is a national character, is a cultural thing.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to all of the participants who raised questions. Since we still have like a few minutes left, Professor Hua, would you like to briefly respond to some of the questions raised by Professor Thomas and Professor Fang?
Okay, and since we don't have too much time left, so I will pick one or two from Professor Thomas and one or two from Professor Fang. And I find that Professor Thomas' comments are very insightful, right? Very insightful. He wants to clarify the issue of civil rights, human rights, because in the West, when we talk about human rights, we include political rights, right? But in the book, I differentiate between civil and political rights from socioeconomic rights. It was because, this is China, right? This is China. And another thing is that Professor Thomas was talking about Datong. Is this Datong a cultural thing? Or is this just a propaganda, rhetoric, not for real, right? So this question is similar to Professor Zhou raised a moment ago, right? I still think it's a cultural thing. For instance, the Chinese social transformation is very different from other countries, right? Other countries. The one example is that when China and Japan were on the conjunction of tradition and modernization, the Japanese sort of they are different, right? They're different from the Chinese in the sense that during the Meiji Restoration, for instance, the Japanese elite does not care about the world. Primarily, then the Meiji Restoration is to save Japan, but the Late Qing reform want to save not only Japan but also the world. That was Kang Youwei, and and also in the state socialism, for instance, in response to the problems created by state socialism and China under Mao and Soviet Union and Lenin took very different strategies. Lenin had his new economic policy, which in his viewpoint is a retreat from communist ideals. Mao instead moved to the ultra-leftist direction by radicalize the movement, by having this cultural revolution and the Great Leap Forward. So I think a culture does make a difference. And also, both Beijing and Taipei gave up war reparations against Japan. And that makes China is the only Asian country that does not receive any war reparations from Japan. All the other Asian countries that were occupied by Japan receive some kind of war reparations. And both Beijing and Taipei announced, forget about money, right? I visited Taiwan. I visited their memorial for World War II. There's a big banner on the gate of the memorial say that we return vice with virtue. In other words, Japanese did lots of horrible things to us. We forgive them, right? Well, we forgive them. Those people who are critical of this, they will say is that, well, the Chinese want to show their moral superiority. And also other people will say, well, there are some geopolitical reasons, strategic reasons behind that too. That's all true, right? But personally, I think culture does make a difference. And I'll answer one or two questions from Professor Fang, right? Professor Fang. And Professor Fang made a very interesting point, right? And about rule of law, right? He said that rule of law did exist, not only in pre-modern China, but even during the Cultural Revolution, right? I found that very interesting, right? Very interesting, right? And because rule by law, by definition, is that law does not apply to the top leader, right? But Zhu Yuanzhang at least made it very clear that the emperor should obey the law as well, right? So on this, Professor Fang was right. Professor, on the other point, I'm not too sure, because Professor Fang said that during the Cultural Revolution, there is a law, right? There is a law. I think that's, he's probably talking about 儒法之争, the debate between legalism and Confucianism, and Mao was on the side of legalism, but there's no law, right? But there's no law. 儒法之争, the debate between Confucianism and legalism was largely at the abstract level. So if you are talking about law, which law was being used during the Cultural Revolution? I think many people do not feel, well, if you are talking about there is a law during the Cultural Revolution, which law? I think people say, well, the only law that existed there is probably the Constitution, 1954 Constitution, which was stopped to be useful 3 years after its publicity. That's according to Peng Zhen or Liu Shaoqi, I forgot. So I think that if you are saying that during the Cultural Revolution there is law, I think is largely referred to the debate between legalism and Confucianism at the abstract level, not in a concrete sense. But I found this very useful. And also another point by Professor Fang about the authorship of Da Tong, I realized that it's not clear. Is Da Tong the idea of Confucius is never settled? But I think this kind of thing is very common, like Sun Tzu's Art of War. There's also a debate about who is Sun Tzu. Is Sun Tzu one person or a group of people? We just don't know. Even in the West, Bible, for instance, who wrote the Bible? The authorship is always in question. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Hua. And thanks to our two panelists and also all our audience. We're right on time. And thank you all for coming and help us hold this very exciting panel, this book launch. I hope you stay tuned to our CCS webinar series. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I would like to join in thanking all of our panelists for intellectually stimulating and thought-provoking webinar. And thank you all in the audience for attending the webinar. I would like to use the last minute to announce our next webinar, which will take place in 2 weeks on Wednesday, October 22nd, from 12 noon to 1:30 Hawaii Standard Time. It will be on Zhang Ailing Zhang, the Chinese novelist, and the talk will be given in Mandarin Chinese, which is a bit unusual because most of our talks are in English. And the title of the talk would be Representing Housewife on Screen, from Ailing Zhang's Long Live the Missus to Kathy's Darling Stay at Home. In Chinese, 戏联与新编张爱玲影评与太太万岁沪港版本的影译系谱. It will be given by Dr. Jia Qizhao, Associate Professor in the Department of Chinese Literature and National Zhongxing University in Taiwan. One of the discussants will be Dr. Mary Shuxian Huang, an Associate Professor at the Chinese Department from Lingnan University in Hong Kong. And another discussant, and who will also serve as a moderator, will be Dr. Yun Peng, an Associate Professor at the Department of East Asian Languages and Literature at UH Manoa. Okay, that concludes our session for today. Mahalo to all and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.